When I was 22, so what seems like a lifetime ago now, I landed myself a security job at a steel plant here in Pennsylvania. It was a pretty easy gig for the most part, but there were a lot of overnight shifts, and depending on who you were working with, those shifts could either suck or be a whole lot of fun. I've been working there for about a year with the same team the whole time when, one day, one of the senior guys announced that he was throwing in the towel. He was moving someplace else to be closer to his family, so naturally, the boss needed to replace him. We all hoped the replacement would be a good guy and a decent worker, but what we got was a guy named Parker. A decent worker who seemed to have all the personality traits of a serial killer. We first met Parker on day shifts because you had to complete your probation period before you were allowed to work nights. He was about 6 feet tall with dark eyes, close-cropped dark hair, and a rough beard. He also had a weird scar on the right side of his neck, like where a patch of skin was paler, pinker, and shinier than the rest. Then, whenever he took his gloves off, you could see that he had the same patches of deep pink scar tissue on the outside of his fingers, like near his knuckles. We figured that he'd been in some kind of accident, like a bad car wreck or something, but since it's not polite to bring that kind of stuff up, no one ever asked him. But then it wasn't Parker's scars that freaked us out. It was the way he acted. He was quiet, real quiet, and whenever he did speak, it was like English was a second language to him. He had a distinct northeastern Pennsylvania accent, and by that I mean like Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, and the Poconos, that kind of area. But then when he spoke, it was like he was fretting over every little syllable. He'd talk like this, as if stressing over every little word. He'd get real jumpy sometimes too, like a skittish horse. He wouldn't scream and dive under the table any time he heard a loud noise, and we guarded a steel plant, so in the daytimes there were many, but you could see him subtly flinch or spin his head around any time something took him by surprise. The guy seemed like a total ball of nerves, and the fellas even joked that he might kill a man if he snuck up on him and spooked him bad enough. But then at the same time, he was a good worker, so while we remained fairly cautious, we eventually accepted him as one of us. About 6 months into Parker working with us, I found out that I'd be working with him for a whole week's worth of night shifts. Just me, him, and a supervisor. Needless to say, I was not looking forward to that. Our super would be in the security office watching cameras and stuffing his face with little pies, but it'd be up to me and Parker to patrol the grounds of the plant on foot. And like I said before, if you were with the right crew, nights could be a doozy. You'd walk around talking about the birds or the flyers, just shooting the breeze and all of that. And then with Parker, I got the feeling that the conversation wasn't exactly going to flow, and the idea of walking around at night with that buttoned-down psycho felt more of a risk than chasing junkies off the site. All in all, it came down to two options: work the shifts or lose out on pay, and so I worked them. I wish I could say working those nights with Parker was like a buddy cop movie or something of that nature, that we slowly warmed up to one another, and we've been pals ever since. But that was not the case. Whenever Parker was sitting in total silence, staring off into space like he was watching a movie no one else could see, he'd be muttering to himself. He'd mostly only do it when he thought no one was around, but I caught him doing it once or twice, and when I did, he sounded like he was real angry about something. And that's what got us all thinking he really was some kind of ticking time bomb. The kind of guy to just snap one day and go totally postal. Naturally, no one wanted to be around him when he did, and when I said that I tried to cozy up to him a little so that he might just skip over shooting me when he finally did bring a gun to work, I'm really only half joking with you. The second night shift we worked together, we were walking around the plant's perimeter fence when I decided to ask Parker what he did before security. And he didn't tell me much, but he did mention having worked for a company that didn't have his back after he got hurt, so he moved on, and that's how he ended up working security. I told him he should just lawyer up and that he could probably win millions if it was some kind of industrial accident, but he told me it wasn't like that, and that the best thing he could have done is just move on. Whatever it was, from the way Parker talked about it, it sounded bad, And with me not being a total jerk, I asked him nothing more about it and changed the subject as quickly as I could. Parker didn't follow any sports, he wasn't into movies like me and some of the other guys there, and he didn't drink, he didn't smoke, and he didn't have any wife or kids or girlfriend. And it got to the point where I asked him, well, what the hell do you do when you're not at work? And he told me he either worked out, worked on his car, or read books. I asked him what kind of books he read, and he started talking about a bunch of old Russian guys whose names I can't even pretend to remember or spell. I've never been much of a reader, and the last thing I read was Huck Finn back in high school, but Parker didn't strike me as much of a reader either, so to hear him talking all fancy like that, it was kind of surprising. He finally managed to find a topic of mutual interests in automobiles, and after Parker told me that he had a 2006 Pontiac GTO, that was all we talked about for the rest of the shift. It was the most conversation any of us had ever had with him, and to me, it was a sign he wasn't going to show up in a hockey mask one day and start chopping us all up with a machete. That's what I told my supervisor too when he asked how working with Parker had been come the end of the shift. I relayed everything I'd been told about Parker getting hurt at the previous job and how in spite of him not giving me much detail, I felt I had a rough idea of what had happened. I said I had no doubt whatsoever that Parker had a messed up past, but that I figured that he was way more of a threat to his former associates than he was to us. And it turns out I was right about that in ways that I could never imagine. On the fourth of what was supposed to be 5 night shifts together, Parker and I stopped by the guard shack by the main entrance for some coffee. It must have been around 1:30 in the morning. It had been a real quiet night, and I planned on working my way through a bag of those mini powdered donuts before we got back on our feet again. I was sitting at the little desk where we kept the logbook, reading through a copy of the previous day's papers someone had left behind while Parker was standing by the shack's window, staring out into the darkness and muttering to himself. 48 hours before, I'd have found that kind of behavior creepy, but it's amazing how quickly you get used to a person's quirks after working a couple of 12-hour night shifts with them. He could stare off into space, mutter to himself a little, and I didn't think it was normal by any stretch, but it didn't freak me out as much as it did when I first met him. But what did freak me out was when out of nowhere, Parker told me, "There's something coming up the road." We never got anyone coming up that road at night, not unless it was someone from security, but they always called ahead. But what was even stranger was when I looked up and saw absolutely nothing on the road outside the shack. Now, keeping in mind that I'm looking for headlights, so when I don't see any, I'm assuming that there's nothing. I also kind of assumed that, I don't know, Parker was just being a little overzealous on account of how jumpy he always was. It wouldn't be the first time that he acted like that and made a mountain out of a molehill, but the boss liked it and said that we should all act a little bit more like that. And so I look up, see nothing, and I respond, "Are you sure, buddy? Because I don't see nothing out there." Parker then says something in response. "They got headlights switched off, but there's something there, all right." And then no sooner had he said that, when the headlights of what looked like a truck or a van switched on so bright that it was almost blinding. I was halfway through yelling out something just like, "Who the hell are those guys?" when Parker turned, and with this real angry look on his face, he comes lunging across the shack at me. I backed up, asking what the hell he was thinking, but he didn't stop. He ran, lowered his body like some football player about to tackle me, and wham! He took me down so hard it knocked the wind out of me, and even though I was fighting for my life, I didn't stand a chance of overpowering him. I had flashes of thoughts running through my mind, stuff about an inside job, about how Parker was a plant and that he was about to kill me to keep me quiet. Hell knows what heist a team would want from a steel plant, but I guess I wasn't thinking straight at the time. This also took place over the space of a couple of seconds, too. Like the lights came on, Parker turned and tackled me. Then, I'm right about to yell, "What are you doing?" when the whole goddamn shack exploded in a shower of glass and sparks. I could hear automatic weapons, maybe half a dozen of them, all slinging lead at the shack, this sort of daka 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 daka. The glass came in first, but after that, You could hear ricochets and see sparks before a bullet hit the light above our heads and plunged the shack into darkness before showering us with even more broken glass. Parker is on top of me the whole time, but obviously by then I realized why he'd taken me to the ground, and I'd quit trying to struggle. He didn't want to hurt me, very much the opposite in fact. The guy I once thought might end up going postal on us was trying to save my life. The gunfire was over in a couple of seconds, and I know it's a huge cliche at this point, but it did feel like way longer. But then the second it went quiet, Parker rolled off of me and then scurried out of the shack at a bit of a crouching position. I wanted to follow him, and I wanted to get up and run, but my legs just wouldn't let me. All I could think about was whatever automatic weapons they had outside, and how if I stood up, they'd put so much lead in me that you could shave my head and use me as a pencil. I wasn't certified to carry a weapon yet, but Parker had shown up certified, which I guess is half the reason he got the job. So while I was armed with nothing but my flashlight and some pepper spray, he'd gone running off carrying our only weapon. I knew whatever brief window I had to escape the shack was gone. Parker had seemed to recognize that the guys outside were reloading and had ducked out of the shack before they had a chance to open fire again. I figured that meant that I had seconds before another hellstorm of bullets ripped through the shack and potentially me too, but then get up and run, and I'd give them something solid to aim at and I'd be totally screwed, not just partially. And so I waited, and waited, half expecting that sound to return again of gunfire and for my lights to go out, but they didn't, and the only thing I heard was the sound of footsteps getting closer and closer to the shack. And like I said before, I had nothing but my pepper spray, but I knew that I had to do something, or whoever was out there was going to walk inside and finish me off. And so I did the only thing I could think to do and start making a lot of noise. I started yelling about how if they took one step closer, I was going to open up with my shotgun, and how even though I wouldn't be able to take all of them out, at least one of them was going to die. The footsteps suddenly stopped, and there was a moment of silence, and then I heard a voice. It sounded like a man who smoked exhaust pipes and ate gravel for breakfast, and when he spoke, he didn't sound mad or scared. He sounded almost smug, asking, "Where's McCabe?" To which I obviously responded, "Who's McCabe?" We didn't have anyone by that name working for us, so you can bet your ass I let them know that lickety-split. And I told them there was no McCabe there, and that's who they were looking for. They'd risked 100 years in prison for absolutely nothing, because whoever that was not here. There was another pause, and then the guy said something like, "I know he's there. I respect you trying to protect him, but it's going to get you killed. And a piece of shit like that isn't worth dying over." I had to tell him a second time that I had exactly zero clue what he was talking about, and that no one had to die because they made a dumb mistake. There was another pause, and I heard the dudes outside sort of whispering to one another, but I couldn't make it out. Then the other guy who smoked exhaust pipes said, "All right, you got to count of 3 to tell us where McCabe is, then we're coming in to kill you." And after that, he started his countdown. After 3, I told him that there was no point in killing me, and all he said in response was 2. And at that, I started thinking that maybe I could dive out of the broken window as they started approaching, and then I could use the shack as cover for a few seconds to run off into the night. The guy shouted 1, and I was thinking, okay, I need to clear this window in one try or I'm dead. And then the guy shouted, "All right, we're..." And that's all I heard, because whatever his next word, it was drowned up by the sound of more gunfire. I heard maybe 9 or 10 shots, and then someone screamed before some fired again. I was so scared I thought that they were just shooting up the shack again, and instead of actually risking safety to get inside the shack to kill me, they were just going to empty the bullets into it again in the hopes that a shot went through and hit me. But then I very quickly realized nothing was hitting the shack. All the shooting was directed at something else outside. I knew that was my golden opportunity to run, but when it came to standing up again, I knew it was just too much of a risk while there were bullets in the air. I had to stay put, wait for the shooting to stop, and then wait for a moment. But literally no sooner than the shooting did stop, I heard footsteps sprinting over to the shack before suddenly, Parker was standing in front of me, pistol in hand, and this absolute psycho kind of look on his face. He barks at me, "Get out of here! There'll be more of them coming!" I don't know what it was about him telling me all of that, but all of a sudden, my legs suddenly remembered how to work again. I didn't thank him. I didn't ask any questions. I just ran full speed towards the plant's security office to take shelter there. There was a chance our super had seen what was happening, but there was also a chance that he hadn't either, so I needed to get there ASAP to make sure the cops got there ASAP too. And now, long story short, we watched the cameras the whole time till the cops do show up, but all we see is the shack all shot up and the headlights of whatever vehicle the shooters had approached in. Parker, or McCabe, whatever you want to call him, was nowhere to be found, nor to my knowledge did he ever resurface. Our boss handed over all his paperwork to the cops, every last scrap that we had to go on, and they came back and told us all of it was false. The only thing that was real was Parker's face, and that it did match a guy named McCabe's who used to be part of some prison gang until his relationship with his associates soured for some reason. And that's all the explanation we ever got, and as far as I know, Parker, or McCabe, is still on the run. I don't know what he did to piss those guys off so much, but I know they made a mistake coming after him like that. A mistake they paid for with their lives. My name is Father Thomas, and I've been with the parish priesthood at St. Nicholas's Catholic Church here in Winchcombe for the past 3.5 years. Winchcombe is a small town here in rural Gloucestershire, and about 5,000 people are very proud to call it home. It's about as quaint a rural English town as you're ever likely to find, with a beautiful village green, a trio of timelessly charming pubs, and even a 15th century Tudor castle on the town's outskirts. There's nowhere on earth I'd rather be living or serving God. But it's also true that Winchcombe has a history steeped in strange and sometimes rather sinister occurrences. Visit the local museum and you'll be told that Winchcombe started life as a Roman hamlet around the middle of the 1st century, but about 3 miles to the southeast, atop a place called Cleve Hill, you'll find traces of a Neolithic burial ground that dates back 5,000 years. The area's inhabitants would take their dead to a chambered long barrow atop the hill, which was not only a place of reverence, but also a place of rite and ritual where the living could commune with the dead. There was a focus on collective memory and kinship, emphasizing the dead as part of a community rather than isolated individuals, and befitting my profession, that's something I find profoundly moving. Yet I've often wondered how much influence those ancestral spirits have today, or if the strange events I've observed around Winchcombe are the echoes of much more recent events. In the 16th century, scandal rocked a nearby monastery known as Hales Abbey. For hundreds of years, the monastery had been home to a religious relic known as the Holy Blood, which consisted of an ornately decorated wooden box containing a glass vial of Jesus Christ's blood. Supposedly, the vial had filled with the blood which dripped from Christ's feet during his crucifixion and had been delivered from the Holy Land by a crusading knight sometime in the 13th century. The knight claimed the relic had been given to him by the monks of a hermitage somewhere near the Dead Sea after defending its occupants against a Saracen raid. The monks guaranteed their very souls on the relic's authenticity, claiming it had once belonged to one of Christ's apostles. Following its interment in Hales Abbey, the monastery became one of the most prominent in all of England. But sometime in the 16th century, an inspection of the Holy Blood uncovered something deeply shocking. The vial containing Christ's blood had been stolen. Following an investigation, the official story became that the Holy Blood had been stolen by a group of professional thieves at the behest of a wealthy benefactor. However, if someone was rich enough to finance the theft of such a relic, you can bet that they had a large house with a large staff. A staff which, if they believed the blood of Christ was secreted somewhere in their home, would have had a very hard time keeping their mouths shut about it. Yet as history shows, neither the thieves nor the buyer were ever found. Many believe the holy blood would still be intact, hidden away somewhere until its inevitable discovery. Others have a much more disconcerting explanation. Shortly after the theft of the holy blood, a royally sanctioned witch finder arrived in Gloucestershire. The King of England, James I, was obsessed with stamping out witchcraft and other heresy, and so when he heard the holy blood had been stolen, he believed devilry was afoot and sent his chief witch finder to root it out. The witchfinder's investigation led to the Burley witch trials, whereby Joan Flower and her two daughters, Margaret and Philippa, were accused of cursing the Earl of Rutland. After half a dozen of the Earl's family and friends suffered sudden and tragic deaths, many blamed a hidden coven of witches. Margaret and Philippa Flower were hunted down, arrested, then hanged following convictions for communing with the devil. Their mother, heartbroken and impoverished, died in prison not long after. A few years later, a woman named Alice Colerne was accused of causing illness and death by using curses and charms. She was convicted following testimonies from her own neighbors and was executed to the cheers of the gathered townsfolk. It's clear that, at the time, many believed that the holy blood had been stolen by the accused and used in a series of profane rituals. They believed these rituals had brought a great and terrible darkness to the region, and it seems there are some who still believe this, even hundreds of years later. I've seen some rather unsettling graffiti around town over the years, things quite unlike the usual dross teenagers like to daub, but those will not be the focus of this memoir. What I've told you are things I wished I knew before I arrived in Witchcombe, and because at the very least I feel like they have helped me understand some of the things that have happened here since. For although I now live a life of peace, harmony, and simplicity, I had to endure a living nightmare to obtain it. I won't stultify you with the finer details of entering the priesthood, but let's just say it's neither quick, nor easy, nor painless. For some prospective priests, it takes years of discernment before they commit themselves. Then after that, you're looking at a decade of training until you're even considered for priesthood. Then, when you finally do become a priest, you have to serve under another much more experienced counterpart before either taking over the parish or being assigned one of your own. That's the exact position I was in when I arrived in Winchcombe back in early 2020. St. Nicholas's Church was under the care of Father Michael, an elderly priest who'd held the position since the mid-1970s. He was set to retire in the summer of 2021, so the idea was I'd spend 18 months under his tutelage before taking over as guardian of the church and parish. The usual period of tutelage is 2 years, so as you can imagine, I was rather surprised at the offer of a rare shortcut. Needless to say, it came with a caveat. Father Michael, who was almost 79 years old when we first met, had been in a state of mental decline for quite some time, and his condition had become of deep concern to many of his parishioners. People spoke of strange sermons, troubling outbursts, or unsettling remarks during cloistered conversations, and to our boss, the Bishop of Clifton, this was unacceptable. If I could keep Father Michael's behavior under wraps and prevent the situation from progressing into a full-blown scandal, then one of the most coveted parishes in England would be mine for as long as I could serve it. I knew it'd be a challenge. I was taking on the role of a carer as well as a priest, but at the same time, it was an absolute no-brainer, as they say. I considered it an honor to be able to tend to a veteran of the church during the twilight of his tenure. I just didn't realize how terribly taxing it would prove to be, both to my faith and to my sanity. I first visited Winchcombe in December of 2019, prior to my confirmation there. Father Michael had something of the final say on who he'd transfer the parish to. But after some afternoon tea and a long conversation on ecumenical matters, the man himself told me that I'd gotten the job. Father Michael wasn't anything like I'd imagined him, and in so many words, I'd been told that he was losing his mind and was a liability to the church, but our meeting suggested nothing of the sort. Father Michael was aged, but his mind was as sharp as his wit, and as I said, we spoke at length on a number of different topics, all of which he displayed a vast knowledge of. He was assertive but welcoming, charming but humble, and displayed wisdom without arrogance. He embodied everything I thought a priest was supposed to, so quirks or no quirks, I was thrilled at the prospect of being mentored by him, even if that mentorship came with its unique set of challenges. In early February of 2020, I moved into the spare room of the cottage that stands behind St. Nicholas's Church. It's a beautiful little cottage with a thatched roof and a small rose garden. It's also my current home and the place that I presently sit and type this memoir. But back when I first arrived, it was a place of great uncertainty for me. But now, almost 5 years to the day since I moved into that cottage, I have more unanswered questions than ever. My first month or so under Father Michael's tutelage went smoothly. I helped him perform Mass, I helped him perform baptisms, and we went through procedures for both weddings and funerals. I accompanied Father Michael on visits to hospitals and nursing homes, and I sat in on pastoral counseling sessions to learn how to provide guidance and support to my future parishioners. I shadowed Father Michael in preparing sermons and homilies, and then when it came to my own personal duties, I would organize Bible study groups or youth group meetings. I also had to manage the daily administrative duties of the church, which kept me very busy, I can assure you. But that first month, aided by the warmth of the Christmas season, made for a very smooth transition into my new life. There were no signs of Father Michael's decline, none of his episodes, as people had taken to calling them, and at first, it appeared the whole thing had been quite overblown. But then, it happened. One evening, after dinner, Father Michael and I were enjoying a cup of tea and a few biscuits when the subject of parish funerals came up. A conversation on that topic then meandered into one about death in general, and while that might sound like a subject too heavy for tea and biscuits, discussion of the afterlife can be a rather common thing for those who take the cloth. Father Michael and I had very briefly touched on the subject while discussing parish funerals on a previous occasion, but that marked the first time that we delved into the subject in depth. He mentioned how his time on earth was drawing to a close, and how he'd been pondering on what that meant for his eternal soul. Father Michael knew he'd lived a good and decent life, one dedicated almost entirely to the church no less, but he still found himself preoccupied by matters of faith. In a remark I thought was a passing one, Father Michael mentioned how he sometimes envied the holy martyrs, those whose dedication to the faith had cost them their lives. He quite rightly said that while priests occupy a special place in heaven, martyrs, by virtue of their sacrifice, may bypass purgatory and enter heaven immediately, as their suffering is considered a purification in itself. And it's this that was the source of his self-confessed envy. The subject of the Church's martyrs is something we're encouraged to reflect on often, but at the time I was only familiar with some of the more well-known martyrs. There's St. Stephen, the first Christian martyr who was stoned to death after preaching about Jesus. Then there's St. Peter, who was crucified upside down as he felt unworthy to die in the same way as Christ. But perhaps the most famous is Paul the Apostle, one of Christianity's greatest evangelists, who was beheaded in Rome under Emperor Nero. Yet although we touched on them, it wasn't these martyrs Father Michael wanted to discuss. He asked if I was aware of St. Sebastian, and I was, but I discovered I wasn't privy to the whole story. Sebastian was murdered by being shot full of arrows, but bizarrely, and unbeknownst to myself, he'd survived this phase of his execution. His awestruck killers, who had never seen such corporeal resilience, then had him cut from the stake he was tied to, and then beaten to death with clubs. They broke every bone in his body, one by one, until massive internal bleeding caused his heart to finally give out, and he passed into martyrdom. Father Michael said that when he recently revisited the tale of Saint Bartholomew, who was skinned alive prior to his beheading to ensure maximum suffering, he felt a deep and shameful sense of envy. He felt the same covetousness when he reread the story of Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who was put to death using a spiked breaking wheel. And for the unfamiliar, the breaking wheel is a method of execution which involves being tied to a large spoked wheel before your legs, arms, and ribs are broken, usually in that order to, again, cause maximum suffering. The wailing victim's shattered limbs are then woven into the breaking wheel's spokes in a sickening cyclical recreation of the human form before being displayed as a warning to others. The fate of those subjected to the breaking wheel is similar to those who underwent crucifixion, in that they didn't expire right away and sometimes spent days at a time clinging to life, their bodies racked with agony until they finally expired. And to put St. Catherine's suffering into perspective, it's said that the breaking wheel broke before she did, shattering from the force of the blows to her body before she was even close to expiring. Then, much like Saint Sebastian, her executioners were so awestruck at her dedication to her faith that they ordered her beheaded, lest her zeal proved contagious. Father Michael said that he also envied Saint Agnes, who was so touched by God's grace that the flames of her execution pyre could not set her ablaze. He felt the same towards Saint Perpetua and Saint Felicity, who in the Roman Colosseum were torn apart by wild animals before being put to the sword. Father Michael claimed to feel a deep melancholy along with a sense of frustration that God had never provided him with a similar opportunity to prove his faith. He acknowledged it was a dark, potentially perturbing point of view, yet it was one he wrestled with nonetheless. As you can all imagine, I found his confession to be deeply unsettling, but relatively unsurprising. I'd received prior warning that Father Michael might say or do some rather unusual things. Preventing such instances was half the reason I was there. But what I was not prepared for was what he said next. In no uncertain terms, Father Michael told me that he was not only envious of the Church's holy martyrs, but also envied those who made them so. Unbeknownst to those who'd beheaded, flayed, or burned the faithful alive, they'd been a part of God's plan, and without their actions, the holy martyrs would not be so venerated today. Even if he himself could not achieve martyrdom, he would gladly swap places with one of the many martyrs' executioners simply to be closer to the act itself. Father Michael said if he'd known the implications of his actions, he'd have tortured St. Catherine long after the wheel broke, knowing her continued suffering would only elevate her status in heaven. As he talked, he became more and more animated, and then more and more manic until suddenly there was spittle flying from his lips as he made his case with wide, frantic eyes. I'm not ashamed to say that I was frightened, because the fear wasn't for myself. It was entirely for the health and well-being of Father Michael. It had been the first time he'd exhibited any objectively disturbing or upsetting behavior, the kind of thing I'd been warned about before my arrival. But still, seeing it up close for the first time and knowing just how graphically he could speak, it made for a chilling revelation. I reported the incident back to the Bishop of Clifton, the head clergyman for all of Gloucestershire, and he essentially told me to keep up the good work. I'd managed to talk Father Michael down from the mild form of mania he'd talked himself into, and he seemed rather self-aware regarding his deteriorating condition, so there was no conflict following my intervention. But the same could not be said for the next instance of de-escalation. Sometime after our conversation on martyrs, Father Michael asked if he could share something with me, something he believed might make me rather uncomfortable. When we got back to the cottage, I put the kettle on, put on a few biscuits and cream cakes, and then sat down for some tea before he made his rather daunting announcement. Father Michael had been talking to an angel. And my heart sank the moment he said it, realizing his condition was far more severe than mere verbal diarrhea. If he was suffering audible or even visual hallucinations, then he evidently required urgent medical care, and as you can very well imagine, I was keen to get to the bottom of his angelic interactions, to determine if they were harmless metaphors or yet more worrying manifestations of his encroaching madness. Father Michael told me that for the past few years, an angel had visited him in the middle of the night, around once a week. He'd awaken in the wee small hours of the morning, not to a voice, but to a feeling, and then after walking downstairs, he'd sit in the darkness, in the chair in the corner of the room, and he'd listen to the angel speak to him. I asked what form this angel appeared to him in, but Father Michael didn't know. He sat in the corner, facing the wall, as a means of protecting himself. He believed looking upon the angel's form without the proper permission would burn his eyes out and set his very mind aflame. I asked Father Thomas what made him think that he didn't have permission to look if the angel was present and conversing with him, and without going into the long-winded explanation he gave me, let's just say that his answers were, at best, inconsistent. I knew he needed help, and he needed it as soon as possible, but when I tried contacting the bishop with my concerns, the only person I could reach was his assistant, a priest whom, to save his own embarrassment, will remain unnamed. Now, Father Nameless, or should that be Father Spineless, claimed the bishop was very busy with prior engagements, but that he'd be more than happy to assist me. Obviously, my request was that he put me in touch with the bishop, because I'd a very important development to report to him, but after almost a week of obfuscating, I realized the bishop was deliberately avoiding my calls. I was furious, but the church's strict hierarchy is just that, strict. I had no choice but to deal with Father Spineless, and the process was as frustrating as it was fruitless. Much like the realization that the bishop was avoiding my calls, there came a point where I realized Father Spineless was acting in a manner one might describe as deliberately obtuse. When I explained that Father Thomas needed urgent psychiatric care, he asked for more details, but when I gave them, he appeared to completely misunderstand both the timeline and the severity of the events. I hadn't dealt with this assistant much, after all. I was only a few months into my Winchcombe tenure, but it didn't take me very long to figure out that he wasn't an imbecile, he was merely acting like one, and all with a view to frustrating my attempts to get help for Father Michael. Without going into too much detail, if Father Michael needed serious psychiatric care before his retirement, the church would be obligated to pay for his medication and potentially even expensive private medical care. But if his condition stayed a secret until after his retirement, then any expenses incurred would be Father Michael's responsibility. The church would still technically be paying for his treatment, but it'd come out of his pension and not their own personal coffers. Break into too much of the budget, and our bishop might lose his standing with the archbishop, which would no doubt affect his chances of climbing the parochial ladder. I didn't find that out from Father Spineless, but when I did, you can bet your arse that I sent some very ungodly language his way when I called him back. The audacity of the bishop to try and further his career, and at the cost of such a senior and well-respected member of the church, seemed nothing short of criminal. Father Spineless simply told me that he'd pass on what I'd said to the bishop, and I assumed it was thinly veiled sarcasm. It was not. Just a few hours later, I received a call from none other than the bishop himself, and to say he wasn't pleased with me would be the understatement of the century. Without giving details of the entire exchange, he rather furiously asked if his instructions had been unclear. He reminded me of what I'd been told prior to accepting my position in Winchcombe, and then asked if there's anything I'd misunderstood. I told him no, that I hadn't misunderstood anything, but that Father Michael needed the kind of urgent care that I was incapable of providing as a mere priest. The bishop then simply told me that if I was incapable of fulfilling my duties, he'd find someone that could. The whole point of me being there was to prevent any kind of scandal, be it moral or, in this case, financial, and in all fairness, that had indeed been made clear to me prior to being formally offered the position. It was either put up and shut up, or hit the road and potentially wait years for the chance to take another parish, because I would most certainly be blacklisted by the bishop. Not formally, you understand, but blacklisted nevertheless. And so I issued a formal verbal apology to the bishop and then reassured him I was capable of the task at hand. And that was the late spring of 2020, and as many of you will remember, lockdowns followed shortly after. I thought the temporary cessation of church services would give Father Michael a well-deserved break, and to an extent, it functioned exactly as I'd hoped. But over time, the prolonged isolation led to a serious and rapid decline in his condition. In the end, I actually considered the social distancing to be something of a double-edged sword, because as much as it played havoc on Father Thomas's mental health, it shielded his deterioration from the public eye. He became increasingly erratic, having difficulty sleeping, and was prone to increasingly maniacal outbursts which both concerned and frightened me deeply. He remained fixated on the concept of martyrdom from the perspective of both the saint and their killer, and I took to locking my door at night for fear that he might do something unspeakable. Thankfully, the easing of lockdowns in the autumn of 2020 helped a great deal with Father Michael's condition. Being thrust back into public life proved something of a shock to the system and one he desperately needed. And so for a while anyway, he was able to get back into a steady routine and was able to focus his mind on much healthier thoughts than those of martyrdom and murder. But once limitations were reintroduced towards All Saints' Day and Father Michael was limited in even the number of funerals he could attend, his condition sank back towards the severe. He became increasingly fixated on the idea that he was about to be the recipient of what he called a heavenly communication. But whenever I pressed him on the matters, he began speaking in scriptural riddles and avoided giving any straight answers. Obviously, it was something I found deeply concerning, but it marked something of a new phase in Father Michael's state of mind. Instead of brooding, irritable, and quick to anger, he was euphoric. As I said, it was deeply concerning, but this new phase came with behaviors that proved considerably more manageable than those previously exhibited. The approaching Christmas season gave him something to focus his mind on, something that wasn't as ghastly or gory as his former fixations, and that I most warmly welcomed. Yet after New Year's Day came and went, things changed dramatically. The isolation of the January lockdowns and the desolation of the bleak British winter proved devastating to Father Michael's state of mind. His conversations with that angel went from being a weekly to an almost nightly affair, which in turn meant his sleep hygiene was atrocious. He became irritable, angry, sometimes even violent, and he smashed household items, snapped at parishioners, and in one instance, I had to physically intervene during a mass after he took a disturbing diversion relating to communing with angels. I began to wonder if I could survive another year of Father Michael's tutelage, and I used the word survive in the literal sense. Little did I know, but he'd be gone within a month. Throughout most of February 2021, Father Michael had been taking a break from his parochial duties. He had refused previous suggestions he undertake a period of rest, but following the cessation of the Christmas period, his mania had been replaced by a rather crippling depression. His public absence was relatively easy to explain, and I was experienced enough to effectively replace him during that period. But then one Sunday morning, the 28th of February to be exact, I awoke to find Father Michael dressed, composed, and ready to administer Mass. It was like all his depression and mania had suddenly evaporated, and not only did he seem perfectly fit and well, but he seemed positively excited to perform Mass. The service itself went impeccably, and the parishioners were positively beaming to see him up and about again following his absence. Then afterwards, over a pot of tea and a few custard creams, I began asking Father Michaels about his rejuvenated state. I asked a few gentle but probing questions. His responses were quite direct. He told me that over the previous 12 months, he'd asked God many questions, none of which had received an answer. But in the early hours of Sunday morning, he'd finally received a response from the angel he'd been communicating with. The angel told him how that very night, Father Michael would be given a sign, and he would not know where, how, or exactly when, but he would be given a sign. Again, I did nothing but worry. He had peaks and then troughs, and then higher as peaks, the lower as troughs. And if his so-called angel failed to reappear that evening, if he didn't receive his so-called sign, there would be a change in his mood and it might plummet toward unmanageable or even dangerous lows. All I could do was hope for the best and be ready for anything. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. Nothing. Father Michael's usual bedtime, the one he stuck to when he wasn't feeling manic, was usually around 9:30 at night. He'd totter off around 9, and I was under the impression that he was undertaking his evening bedtime routine, but then suddenly, he reappeared fully dressed and began to put his coat on. I asked him where he was going, but he didn't respond. He just walked towards the front door of the cottage, and then as he opened it, he looked at me and said, "You're going to follow me." He didn't say it in the imperative. It wasn't a command. It was a statement. An emotionless statement of cold, hard fact. Because as he stepped out of the cottage and began walking off into the night, I rushed to put on my own coat and hat and then followed him. All of my questions went unanswered. Father Michael simply told me to be patient and then led me on a short walk out into a field just east of Silk Mill Lane. I walked through the trees, crossed the public footpath, and then stopped someplace in the middle of the field looking out toward Rushley Lane. I once again asked Father Michael what he was doing, but instead of further dismissal of my question, he told me, "We're waiting," and then took something small from his pocket and unfolded it. It was a penknife, its blade glinting in the pale moonlight. I pulled out my phone and placed a phone call to the local police at exactly 9:47 p.m., I remember. I told them Father Michael was having another of his episodes, but that this was one much more severe than the others. The dispatcher told me officers would be there within minutes, and then after that, I hung up and went about trying to talk Father Michael out of doing whatever I believed he was planning on doing. But he struck me. Really struck me, I mean, and it wasn't the knife that he produced. It was how calm and collected he was. As I begged him to fold away that knife and reconsider whatever he was planning, Father Michael simply smiled. He told me all I needed to do was wait a few more minutes and then all would become clear. I told him the police were on their way, and that in order to prevent a scandal, he needed to make sure that that knife was out of sight before they arrived. Father Michael didn't listen and once again simply told me to be patient. A wave of relief washed over me as I saw the blue flashing lights of the police car behind us, and I began calling out to them as they advanced in our direction. Once they drew level, I told them Father Michael had a knife, at which point the officer produced an electric stun gun. I saw him produce that stun gun, then turn back towards Father Michael, intent on begging him to put down the knife, and something happened that I have yet to reconcile with my own sanity. Father Michael was looking up into the skies, completely deaf to the pleas of both myself and the police officers, and then out of nowhere, there was a great green flash in the sky before a sharp streak of bright white light bursts from the green flash. It was one of the most incredible things I'd ever seen, and then as the strange lights faded and a great boom echoed across the skies, Father Michael turned. He told me his question had been answered, that he was to be martyred at the hands of the man standing in that field with him, and that man was me. He approached me with a knife, holding it out by the blade as the police screamed at him to stand still and put the knife down. All three of us, myself and the two officers, began backing away from Father Michael, begging him to stop what he was doing before somebody got hurt. He commanded me to kill him, over and over again, and each time I refused, he became more and more irate. Then finally, he completely lost his mind. He turned the knife around, charged at me with it raised above his head, and was instantly shot by the stun gun wielding policeman. He dropped to the ground, fell conscious, and was swiftly transported to hospital where I was assured that he had every hope of making a full recovery. But Father Michael, never woke up. The stun gun's charge, in tandem with an undiagnosed heart condition, had a terrible effect on Father Michael's cardiovascular health. He grew worse and worse until eventually he simply passed away in the early hours of the following morning. I was the first to hear the news, and when I did, I wept. But it wasn't so much shock or grief that brought tears to my eyes. It was that Father Michael had been proven right. Father Michael believed God had told him how he'd be martyred that night by someone standing in that field with him. He believed the Winchcombe meteorite, which has since been completely and scientifically explained, was his sign that he was indeed to become a holy martyr. He didn't believe he'd leave that field alive, and in more ways than one, the actions of that policeman proved him exactly right. I have no idea how Father Michael knew about the meteorite. Sometimes I think it was all just some terrible coincidence and that its sudden appearance was a matter of misfortune. But other times I think differently. Frankly, I'm not sure what to think anymore. The only thing I know for certain about the incident is that it joins the long list of other strange occurrences that have taken place in Winchcombe over the years. And doubtless, there will be many, many more. Back in 2013, I was a deputy manager at a hardware store here in Delaware. For my morning shifts, I'd open the place up, get the computer and registers up and running, then I'd head into the office to check our answering machine. This was probably one of the more crucial aspects of my morning routine because that was my way of finding out if any deliveries had canceled, if anything was arriving earlier than expected, and also if anyone had called in sick that morning. So I sit down with my coffee and I listen to maybe 2 or 3 fairly routine messages. Then, when I hit play on the next one, I recognized the voice right away. I'd been half expecting to hear Greg's voice on one of the messages because he was supposed to be there that morning to help me open up. Hearing his voice was kind of a relief at first because at least I knew that he was okay and just sick. But that's not what he'd called to tell us. Greg was an older guy, close to retirement age, and he was quite possibly the sweetest man I'd ever had the pleasure of working with. So naturally, when I didn't see him that morning, I was concerned. I figured he was going to say how he wasn't feeling too good, how he was going to take the day off, and as much as it was going to suck trying to find coverage for him, I was just glad to know that he was okay. But what he had to tell us was anything but reassuring. The message started with, "Good morning, ladies," which made me smile right away because it was how he greeted us every morning. But then he went on to say, "I'm real sorry, but I don't think I'll be making it into work tomorrow morning. I'm going to see Sherry." I didn't know who this Sherry person was, but I also wasn't super close with Greg, not like he was with the ladies who worked on the store's floor or registers, and so I went to ask them. I asked my coworker, a woman named Janine, who Sherry was in relation to Greg, and then the way that she looked at me told me almost everything I needed to know. Sherry was Greg's wife. At least she had been until she passed away. I guess that doesn't make her not his wife, but you see what I mean. And so when he said he was going to see Sherry, I figured that he meant that he was going to visit her grave or something. But then when I said that and expressed why I wasn't sure that warranted a sick day, Janine totally agreed. She says it wasn't like Greg to ever call in sick, and he only ever visited Sherry's grave on their anniversary, their birthday, and usually once around the holidays. I then asked Janine, "Well, what does it mean when he says he's going to see Sherry?" And after she turned a whiter shade of pale, she simply responded with, "I think you better go make some phone calls." To which I did. I called Greg on his cell, maybe 2 or 3 times, hoping maybe he just wasn't hearing the phone, and I tried his home phone number, but again, my calls went unanswered. I put the phone down, and then I swear to God, not even 2 seconds goes by before it rings. I'm hoping it's Greg, but it's not. It's Greg's son. Then when I asked if his dad was okay, he told me, no, Greg was not okay. In fact, he passed away during the night. Greg's son said that this is what he figured from having seen the scene. It appeared his dad had gotten a bunch of paperwork done, including his will, before laying down in an easy chair and just slipping away during the night. He'd watered his houseplants, paid his bills, put on his best suit and shined his shoes, and then after leaving messages for us and one for his choir director letting him know that he wouldn't need a ride to practice, Greg laid down in his recliner and just died. There was nothing to suggest that he'd expedited his exit, so to speak. There were no pills, no blood, no clear plastic bags or anything of that nature. Everything looked entirely painless and entirely natural. But then somehow I find that all the more haunting. The thing that scares me is sort of how he knew it was his time. Do we all know when we're close to death? And do we all feel so goddamn cheery about it, or was Greg just not afraid to go? The whole thing with Greg isn't the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. I've been in a 14-car pileup where a family of 4 died, and let me tell you, that was way more terrifying than finding out Greg had passed away peacefully. But that accident doesn't stick with me the way Greg's sudden passing does, and I guess that's because all of those unanswered questions regarding one of the few things we all share. Man, woman, or child, east or west, north or south, our unstoppable and inevitable end. I know this is a bit of an unusual request, but I was hoping you could give me some advice on how to handle a situation with a male colleague of mine. Now, I'd rather not say where I live or work or anything like that. I'd like to just try and keep this as anonymous as possible, but here's the gist of my story. We first met when I started working at a large retail store that had lots of employees. He was the first person to really make an effort to be friendly with me, and I thought that we might end up being work friends, but I was wrong. It quite quickly progressed from him being warm but platonically friendly to asking me to go out for drinks with him. I wasn't looking for a relationship at the time, and I knew exactly what the implication of his invitation were, so each time he'd ask me, I'd politely decline, hoping he'd eventually take the hint. But he didn't. He seemed to think that if he just kept asking, that I'd eventually say yes. I didn't have the heart to tell him that I didn't like him like that, but I also didn't want to lie and say that I had a boyfriend. In the end, I thought the best thing to do would be to transfer to a different department, but it became this sort of cat-and-mouse game of him following me wherever I went in terms of departmental transfer. In the end, I had to go to HR about it, and only then did they stop his transfers without cluing him into the fact that I'd approached them. I'd made the mistake of giving him my phone number when I first started, as he'd offered to work any shifts I needed covering. But after realizing he was only going to use that to pester me, I blocked his number. I made my social media private, but he sent me a follow request anyways, and I chose to just ignore it, once again assuming that he'd have the emotional maturity to just understand his attention was not appreciated. But again, he did not. His increasingly stalker-like behavior wasn't all that much of a problem at the time. I'd made sure our 2 departments were just about as far removed from one another as it was possible to be, so it wasn't like we bumped into each other often. And when we did, it was just sort of a smile and a nod kind of exchange as we went about our duties. But then one evening, after we'd all closed up and I was walking to my car, I looked up from my phone to see him, standing near my driver's side like he'd been waiting for me. It was early winter, so it had long gone dark by the time we got out. I'd parked my car quite far from the store, so there was hardly anyone else around as I was walking. And then suddenly, there's my cheerful stalker, who's basically cornering me in a dark car park. I was a mix of startled and nervous, but I just did what I usually did in that sort of situation and tried to be as friendly and disarming as possible. I asked what I could do for him, and he started trying to make small talk. I humored him for a moment or two and then very politely asked him what he wanted. Then, when he asked if I could give him a lift home, I felt my heart jump into my throat. I knew he lived on my route home, close to it anyway, but I knew he knew that too, so turning him down wasn't going to be easy without coming across as rude or selfish. Side note, this also might seem like a perfectly normal exchange, and I might seem selfish in not giving him a lift home, but this was not a normal exchange. This guy couldn't take the hint that I wasn't into him, so he clearly wasn't playing with a full deck. And now he's blocking me from getting into my car in a dark car park after making sure that there's no one else around but me and him. I'm not trying to use this to slag off men, so please don't think I'm doing that. But sometimes, guys just don't appreciate how pant-shittingly terrifying that kind of behavior is to girls. He was quite capable of overpowering me if he wanted to, which is why I had to stay on my best behavior and keep him sweet. But he made that very, very difficult for me, and part of me thinks he did it deliberately. In the nicest voice I could possibly muster, I told him I was too busy to give him a lift, and then made up some excuse about having to pick up my mom from her friend's house. I just really didn't want to be alone in the car with him. I had visions of dropping him off at his flat, asking me to come inside, and then making a big scene and refusing to get out of my car after I rejected him, none of which I am emotionally equipped to deal with. And so quite naturally, I didn't want him anywhere I couldn't physically remove him, especially the passenger seat of my car. I gave him my excuse, and he seemed to take it on the chin, but then made a sharp segue into the ignored Instagram follow request. And when he asked me if I'd seen it, I lied. I told him I hadn't, and that I had been taking a bit of a mental health break from social media,